Imagine feeding your family with less than 4 cents for cornmeal when more than half your neighbors are out of work and government relief skips your doorstep because of your skin color. This was daily life for millions of Black Americans in the 1930s, when the Great Depression and vicious Jim Crow laws turned eating into an act of resistance. The ingenious, humble meals that emerged, 30 dishes you will not find in glossy cookbooks, were not just about survival, but about holding on to dignity and heritage against impossible odds. How did these foods defy history's worst hunger, and what stories are hidden in every bite? They also revealed the broader food history of the 1930s, the coping strategies, regional traditions, and the creativity that fed entire communities. Unemployment in Black communities soared past 50% as the economic collapse deepened. In cities like Chicago, more than half of Black workers lost their jobs, double the rate of their white neighbors. Down south, the numbers were even starker. Sharecropping contracts bound families to land they didn't own, forcing them to hand over 70% of every harvest to white landlords. When cotton prices crashed, landowners pocketed federal payouts and evicted more than 100,000 Black tenant farmers, leaving entire families homeless and hungry. Jim Crow laws ruled every aspect of daily life, from the fields to the dinner table. Black families were the first to be fired and the last to be hired, shut out of unions and government work programs. When relief finally trickled down, it arrived in smaller portions or not at all. In Mississippi, Black families on relief received less than half the monthly aid given to whites. In Alabama, the ration sometimes dropped to $1 a month, barely enough for a sack of cornmeal and a few pounds of beans. Survival wasn't just about finding work. Most Southern Black households didn't own farmland or gardens. They worked land owned by others, scraping by on what little they could keep. The cycle of debt meant every autumn's harvest paid off last year's bills, leaving cupboards bare by winter. In cities, new arrivals from the Great Migration found different barriers. Factory jobs dried up fast, and landlords crowded families into cramped apartments with no space for gardens or livestock. Grocery stores in Black neighborhoods stocked fewer fresh goods and charged more for staples like flour, lard, and sugar. Imagine the scene. The numbers tell only part of the story. A mother standing in line for relief, knowing her family's name would be called last, if at all. A father returning home from the fields with empty pockets after a week's labor that barely covered the cost of rent and seed. Children learned early to stretch a single biscuit or a bowl of beans, and every meal became a lesson in patience and improvisation. Even the most basic foods, cornmeal, beans, and greens, were hard-won, rationed, or foraged from fields and vacant lots. These conditions shaped every dish that followed, turning scraps and cast-offs into the backbone of Black culinary survival. Federal relief programs arrived with promises of help, but the reality for Black families was a maze of barriers. In the South, local officials controlled who got food, and Black applicants were pushed to the bottom of every list. Federal Emergency Relief Administration records from 1934 show that in Mississippi, Black families on relief received less than half the rations given to whites. Even in cities like Chicago, where hope ran high for those who made the journey north, only 12% of Black applicants were approved for food aid, though they made up 1/4 of the need. The Chicago Defender printed stories of families turned away from soup lines, their names crossed off for reasons that change with every visit. Commodity foods, flour, beans, salt pork, were distributed by agencies run by white officials that rationed out the best to their own. In Alabama, Black households sometimes received just a few pounds of cornmeal and beans for the entire month. The Pittsburgh Courier reported that in some southern counties, Black families were given food labeled as surplus animal feed. Relief lines grew longer, but the portions grew smaller, and the message was clear. Survival would not come from the government. Faced with empty cupboards and shrinking rations, families turned to each other and to the land. When the relief office shut its doors, mothers gathered wild greens from vacant lots, and fathers traded odd jobs for scraps from butchers or grocers. Children learned to spot edible weeds, poke salad, dandelion, and wild onions, transforming what others ignored into dinner. Church kitchens became lifelines, where pots of beans and rice stretched to feed dozens. Neighbors pooled what little they had, sharing the burden and the bounty. But for many, the only way out was a train ticket north. From 1910 to 1940, more than 1.6 million Black Southerners left behind fields and farm shacks, seeking work and dignity in cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago. The Great Migration was not just a movement of people, it was a shift in how Black families fed themselves. In the urban North, gardens disappeared, replaced by crowded pantries and corner stores. Fresh vegetables gave way to canned tomatoes and dried beans. Butchers offered bologna and sausage instead of fresh cuts. The market stalls of the South Side buzzed with new ingredients, okra, yams, and smoked fish, while old favorites were reinvented to fit city life. The journey north changed more than geography. It demanded new kinds of ingenuity. With relief rations unreliable and prices high in Black neighborhoods, home cooks learned to stretch a dime further than ever. Recipes traveled by word of mouth and church bulletin, adapting to whatever could be found. Cornbread was still king, but now it might be made with condensed milk or baked atop a radiator in a tiny apartment. Beans simmered with smoked neck bones instead of ham hocks. Families made do, and in doing so, they built a new food tradition, one that honored the resourcefulness of the South and the grit of the city. Through every hardship, the kitchen remained a place of hope, invention, and survival. During the Great Depression, making a meal stretch in the 1930s required a kind of kitchen wisdom passed down by necessity, not choice. When money was tight and cupboards were nearly empty, every scrap mattered. Elders remembered how to turn a handful of cornmeal, just 4 cents a pound, into pone bread that could feed a family for days. Sometimes the bread was baked right in the ashes of a wood fire with no oven needed. The outside crisp and smoky, the inside dense enough to keep hunger at bay until the next meal. Ash cakes like these were not just quick, they saved precious fuel and made use of what little was on hand. Meat was rare, but nothing from the butcher went to waste. When a hog was slaughtered, the fat was rendered down, slowly melted, and strained to make lard. This homemade lard became the foundation for frying, baking, and even greasing pans. Cracklings, the crispy bits left after rendering, were mixed into bread or eaten straight for a salty treat. Lard could be kept for weeks in a cool cellar, stretching out flavor and calories long after the fresh pork was gone. With sugar costing 10 cents a pound, sweetening often came from sorghum or molasses, cheaper alternatives that could be drizzled over biscuits or stirred into mush. Syrup sandwiches, made from leftover bread and a smear of molasses, filled lunch pails and quieted rumbling stomachs. In the absence of store-bought yeast, some cooks kept a jar of sourdough starter bubbling on the counter, feeding it with flour and water so bread would rise without spending an extra dime. Foraging was a skill passed to every child. Wild greens, like poke salad, dandelion, and lamb's quarters, grew free in fields and along fence lines. Mothers taught their children how to spot edible weeds, while fathers traded a few hours' work for a sack of dried beans or a hunk of salt pork. Even onion tops and beet greens, often tossed aside by others, found their way into the pot. Nothing was ever thrown out if it could be eaten or reused. The liquid left from simmering collards or beans, known as pot liquor, was poured over crumbled cornbread or saved to cook rice, pulling every last bit of nutrition from the greens. Some families kept a pot going for days, adding water, beans, and whatever scraps they could find so the stew never ran dry. In the kitchen, thrift and creativity walked hand in hand. Every meal was a lesson in making little go a long way. Every technique, whether it was rendering lard, baking in ashes, or gathering wild greens, became an act of survival and pride. These methods did not just fill bellies, they built the foundation for dishes that would become family traditions, remembered long after hard times passed. Cornbread was the anchor of every meal, its scent drifting from kitchens morning to night. Elders remember the golden crust, the way a hoe cake sizzled on a griddle, or, on rare days, right on a garden hoe over open flames. Cornmeal cost little, but it filled bellies and lasted through lean seasons. Slices were eaten with molasses dipped in beans or crumbled into pot liquor. The savory broth left after greens simmered for hours. That broth, rich in vitamins and flavor, was never wasted. Grandmothers poured it over day-old cornbread, making sure nothing from the garden or table went unused. Hoppin' John was more than a New Year's wish for luck. It was a staple. Black-eyed peas and rice stretched into a meal that could feed a family. Together, peas and rice made a complete protein, crucial for those working long days in fields or factories. Shelling peas on the porch became a ritual, hands moving in rhythm as stories passed between generations. Even in city apartments, Hoppin' John stayed on the stove, turning a handful of beans and rice into sustenance for 8. Collard greens and pig's feet simmered slowly, filling homes with a scent that meant comfort. Collards thrived in poor soil and survived frost, a dependable green when little else grew. Pig's feet, often overlooked, brought flavor and gelatin to the pot. The resulting broth, pot liquor, was so prized that children begged for a cup, sometimes sopping it up with scraps of bread. This dish marked Sundays and hard-earned celebrations, a reminder that survival could taste like home. Ham bone stew stretched the last bit of meat into days of dinners. One ham bone, saved from a holiday roast or begged from a butcher, went into a pot with beans and whatever vegetables could be found. Each day, more water, another handful of beans, maybe a stray carrot. The stew never seemed to run out, each bowl carrying the memory of meals before it. Families called it the pot that never emptied, a quiet symbol of hope and resourcefulness. Peanut soup warmed cold nights in places where peanuts were cheap and plentiful. Roasted peanuts, ground and simmered with onions or a bit of broth, made a creamy, nourishing soup. Children scraped bowls clean, knowing this simple dish could keep them strong through lean times. Sweet potato pie turned a humble root into dessert and celebration. Mashed sweet potatoes, spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg, filled pie shells made from leftover lard and flour. Sometimes the only sweetness came from the potatoes themselves. These pies appeared on holiday tables and at church suppers, proof that celebration could come from the earth. Bread pudding made use of every last crust. Stale bread soaked in milk or water, mixed with syrup or molasses, and baked until golden. Raisins or apples, if they could be spared, added bursts of flavor. Born from thrift, bread pudding tasted like comfort, each bite carrying the wisdom and care of those who made it. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, African American families stretched scarce ingredients into meals that meant survival. They cooked with what they had, preserved what they could, and turned leftovers into something nourishing and sometimes surprisingly delicious. Rice and gravy stretched a handful of rice with a peppery sauce made from meat drippings, fueling long days in fields and factories. Fatback and syrup sandwiches paired crisp pork fat with cane syrup on bread, a salty and sweet meal for a nickel. Eggs and molasses toast wrapped in wax paper traveled north with families during the Great Migration, simple, portable, filling. Smoked neckbone and cabbage stew simmered cheap cuts with cabbage or potatoes, so leftovers would feed a crowd. Chicken gizzards with rice gravy turned tough organ meat into a tender meal after 12-hour shifts. Braised ox tongue with onions transformed butcher cast-offs into Sunday supper. Fried cabbage with hot vinegar sharpened humble greens cooked in pork grease and vinegar. Fried bologna sandwiches, sometimes called poor man's steak, crisped bologna in a skillet and tucked it into white bread. Hot sausage po' boys, or half smokes, combine smoky sausage, mustard, and onions in a soft roll sold on city corners. Hoover stew mixed hot dogs, beans, and canned tomatoes into a filling one-pot meal. Sorghum syrup, bread, sweetened biscuits when sugar ran short. Pinto bean loaf, mashed beans as a meat substitute and baked until firm. Collard greens with fatback simmered for hours and cost pennies a serving. Candied carrots glazed root vegetables with syrup to warm winter tables. Tomato and cornbread skillet brought together garden tomatoes and leftover cornbread for supper. Field peas and snaps slow cooked with green beans made a smoky stew. Pot liquor soup captured every drop from simmered greens and poured it over bread. Ash cakes baked in wood ashes were just cornmeal, water, and fire. Vinegar pie, tart and simple, made dessert from almost nothing. Ham hock beans stretched a single hock through pots of beans. Molasses fried apples sweetened fruit with syrup. Rabbit stew added precious protein. Cornmeal mush, fried or boiled, became breakfast or dinner. Pickled beets and eggs preserved in jars brightened winter meals with color and tang. Beyond this inventory, the food history of the period shows patterns that shaped American cuisine for decades. Preservation techniques, thrift, regional crops, and the migration of families to cities spread flavors and methods across the country. These humble dishes created a lasting culinary legacy that still informs Southern and Black American cooking today. Recipes born from hardship are more than survival. They are a living record of creativity, care, and community. Across generations, these dishes became the roots of what the world now calls soul food. The ingenuity that turned scraps into sustenance was never just about filling a belly. It was about holding on to dignity, passing down wisdom, and keeping families together through the leanest years. Food historian Tony Tipton Martin describes this tradition as a continuum, a line connecting the unnamed cooks of the past to today's celebrated chefs. In her research for the Jemima Code, she uncovered more than 150 Black cookbooks, each one proof that Black cooks have shaped American cuisine far beyond the margins. Some books were handwritten and stained with use, and they carry the voices of women and men who measured by feel, tasted as they went, and adapted every recipe to what the day allowed. Their methods, handed down in kitchens and remembered at reunions, became the backbone of family gatherings and Sunday dinners. Modern chefs and home cooks are reaching back to these roots, reviving old recipes and restoring their place in the American story. Dishes once born from necessity are now celebrated for their depth in history. The flavors that once whispered of struggle now speak of pride, resilience, and heritage. Every time a pot of beans simmers or cornbread is sliced, it carries forward the stories and strength of those who came before. There is power in remembering and power in sharing. Preserving these recipes, whether in a well-worn cookbook, a family memory, or a handwritten note, keeps the lineage alive. Each meal is an invitation to honor the past, to nourish the present, and to pass the story on. Today, food insecurity still hits Black households at nearly twice the national average, a legacy rooted in barriers first forged during the 1930s, when segregation, limited access to land and jobs, and the Great Depression reshaped diets across the country. Every meal born from struggle is a reminder. Resilience shapes culture, and justice demands more. What we choose to serve and who gets to eat still defines America. Thanks for watching. Please share your stories of survival and tell us what traditions you carry forward.